There is a place where time moves differently, where the rhythm of wooden shuttles and the soft whisper of thread against thread creates a music older than memory. In a small valley town in Vermont, nestled between rolling hills that turn gold in autumn and white in winter, there stands a weathered building that has known 3 centuries of hands, of patience, of transformation. The weaving studio sits on Millbrook Lane, a street so quiet that you can hear individual leaves settling under the ground in fall. The building itself is modest. 2 stories of gray clapboard siding, windows that catch the afternoon light just so, and a hand-painted sign that simply reads Riverside Weavers in letters that have faded to the color of sage. Inside, the air holds the scent of wool and cotton, of linseed oil rubbed into cherry wood, of dust motes dancing in slanted sunlight. There are 7 looms in the main room, each one different, each one with its own voice. The large floor loom by the east window that creaks like a ship at sea. The small table loom that whispers like wind through grass. The antique loom in the corner that belonged to someone's great-grandmother and still carries the memory of her hands in its smooth, worn heddles. This is where Margaret found herself on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the world outside had just begun its slow exhale into autumn, when the light had taken on that particular golden quality that makes everything look like it's being remembered rather than experienced. She had not planned to be here. Plans, she had learned, were fragile things. 3 months earlier, Margaret had been a different person, living a different life. A senior marketing executive in Boston, her days measured in quarterly projections and client presentations. Her nights spent answering emails in her high-rise apartment, overlooking the harbor. She had been successful by every metric that mattered to the world she inhabited. Her calendar had been full. Her phone had never stopped buzzing. Her reflection in the glass walls of conference rooms had shown a woman in her early 50s who looked capable, professional, in control. And then her body had quietly, insistently suggested otherwise. The word the doctor had used was burnout, though that seemed too small, too neat for what Margaret had experienced. It hadn't felt like burning out. It had felt like dissolving, like she was becoming translucent, like if she stood still long enough, people might start to see through her to the wall behind. Her sister Jane, who lived in this small Vermont town, had offered the guest room above her garage. Just for a while, Jane had said, just until you figure out what comes next. Margaret had accepted because she had no other ideas, and because the thought of her empty apartment with its views of the harbor had suddenly seemed unbearable. All that water, all that distance, all that endless movement going nowhere. The guest room was small and slanted, with a dormer window that looked out over Jane's backyard and the hills beyond. Margaret had been there for 2 weeks, spending her days sleeping late, taking long, aimless walks, and trying not to think about the life she'd left behind when Jane had mentioned the weaving studio. They have drop-in sessions on Tuesday afternoons, Jane had said over breakfast. Anyone can come. You don't need to know anything. Margot, she's the woman who runs it. She's wonderful, very gentle, no pressure. Margaret had said no thank you, because she wasn't ready for people yet, wasn't ready for questions or sympathy or the weight of explaining herself. But then Tuesday had arrived, and the guest room had felt too small, and the prospect of another afternoon walking the same loop around the same pond had seemed suddenly intolerable. So she had found herself standing outside the weathered gray building, reading the hand-painted sign, listening to the sound of something rhythmic and peaceful coming from inside. The door had opened easily under her hand. Inside, the main room was exactly as I described it to you, full of light and looms, and that particular quality of peaceful industriousness that comes from craft done slowly, done well, done for its own sake, rather than for any external reward. There were 4 other people already there, seated at various looms, their hands moving with practiced ease. No one looked up when Margaret entered. This wasn't rudeness. It was the deep absorption of people engaged in work that required their full attention, the kind of focus that exists outside of social convention. A woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, stood at a large table in the center of the room, winding thread onto a wooden bobbin. She glanced up as Margaret hesitated in the doorway. "You must be Jane's sister," she said, her voice warm but not effusive. "I'm Margot. Come in, close the door. There's a draft." Margaret did as she was told, grateful not to be asked how she was doing or what brought her here. "Have you woven before?" Margot asked, setting down the bobbin. "No, never." "Good. That means you haven't learned any bad habits yet." Margot smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Let me show you the basics. We'll start simple. Just plain weave, nothing fancy. The point isn't to make something impressive. The point is just to do the thing." She led Margaret to a small table loomed by the window, already warped with cream-colored cotton thread. The warp threads ran parallel and taut, ready for the weft to be woven through them. "This is already set up for you," Margot explained. "All you need to do is pass the shuttle through, change the shed, and do it again. Like this." Her hands demonstrated, lifting a lever that raised half the warp threads, passing a wooden shuttle through the opening this created, pressing the threads tight with a flat wooden beater, then lifting the other lever to reverse the pattern and passing the shuttle back through. It looked simple. It looked meditative. It looked like something Margaret's tired mind might be able to handle. "Here," Margot said, stepping back. "You try." Margaret sat down on the wooden stool. The loom was at a comfortable height. The shuttle fit naturally in her hand. She lifted the first lever, and half the threads rose obediently. She passed the shuttle through the opening, the shed, Margot had called it. She pressed the beater forward, hearing the soft thunk of weft settling into place. She lifted the second lever, passed the shuttle back through. One complete cycle. One line of weaving, perhaps a quarter-inch of progress. "Perfect," Margot said. "Now just keep going. There's no hurry. There's nowhere to get to. Just this shuttle, this thread, this moment." She moved away to help someone else, leaving Margaret alone with the loom. Margaret continued, lift, pass, beat, change, lift, pass, beat, change. The rhythm was simple enough that her hands learned it quickly, complex enough that her mind couldn't wander too far. The shuttle moved back and forth. The fabric grew slowly, steadily, one line at a time. Around her, the studio held its peaceful sounds, the various looms at their work, each with its own voice. Someone's quiet humming, the sound of thread sliding through heddles, footsteps on the old wooden floor, Margot's gentle voice, offering occasional guidance or encouragement. Margaret wove. She had no idea how much time had passed when she finally looked up. The light through the window had shifted. Her small rectangle of fabric had grown by several inches. Her shoulders, which had been tight and high when she'd entered the studio, had dropped. Her breathing had slowed. "That's lovely work," Margot said, appearing beside her. "How do you feel?" Margaret considered the question. "Quiet," she said finally. "I feel quiet." Margot nodded as if this was exactly the right answer. "That's what the loom does, if you let it. It gives you permission to be where you are, doing what you're doing, nothing more." Margaret looked down at her hands, still holding the shuttle. "Can I come back?" "Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2 to 5, Margot said. "Drop in whenever you like. There's always a loom available." That had been the beginning. Now, 6 weeks later, Margaret came to the studio 4 or 5 times a week. She had her own loom now, not the small table loom she'd started on, but one of the larger floor looms, big enough for more complex projects. Margot had taught her to warp it herself, a process that was intricate and meditative, requiring her to measure out hundreds of threads to exact lengths, to wind them onto the loom in a specific sequence, to thread each one through tiny heddles in a pattern that would determine what the finished fabric could become. The warping alone took hours. Margaret loved it. She loved the planning phase, choosing colors and textures of thread, sketching patterns on graph paper, calculating how many yards of warp she would need. She loved the physical process of winding the warp, walking back and forth in the studio, with threads trailing behind her like a strange ceremonial procession. She loved threading the heddles, which required focus so complete that the rest of the world simply fell away. But most of all, she loved the weaving itself, the hours spent at the loom, hands and feet working in coordination, shuttle passing back and forth, fabric emerging inch by patient inch. It was work that required her full attention, but didn't drain her. It was work that had no deadline, no quarterly projections, no client presentations. It was work that she could see and touch, that accumulated visibly. That was exactly what it appeared to be. The other weavers had become familiar presences, though Margaret had learned almost nothing about their outside lives. There was Elena, a woman in her 40s who always wore hand-knitted sweaters and wove intricate patterns that looked like birch bark. There was David, retired, who made simple striped blankets and donated them all to a homeless shelter downtown. There was young Sarah, a college student who came in whenever her class schedule allowed, usually with textbooks that she studied during breaks from weaving. They didn't chat much while they worked. The looms required concentration, but there was a camaraderie in the shared space, a comfortable parallel existence that Margaret found easier than conversation. Margot moved among them all like a gentle shepherd, offering advice when asked, fixing threading mistakes, sharing her own projects and techniques. She had been weaving for 40 years, had learned from her own grandmother, had traveled to study with weavers in Guatemala and Thailand and Scotland. But she wore her expertise lightly, never making anyone feel less capable or knowledgeable. Weaving is an ancient practice, she had told Margaret one afternoon. Humans have been doing this for 10,000 years, on every continent, in every culture. When you sit at a loom, you're joining a tradition older than writing, older than cities. You're doing what your ancestors did, what their ancestors did. That's part of why it feels so right, so natural. It's in our bones. Margaret had liked that idea, that her hands were remembering something her mind had never known. On this particular evening in late October, Margaret stayed after the other weavers had gone home. Margot was working on a complex piece on the large loom by the window, and Margaret was finishing a scarf she'd been making. Nothing fancy, just stripes in shades of blue and gray that reminded her of the ocean she'd left behind in Boston. The light was fading outside. Margot had turned on the studio's old brass lamps, which cast a warm glow over the room. The building creaked and settled around them. It was fully dark outside now, the windows reflecting the room back to itself. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said, surprising herself. She wasn't usually one for personal questions. "Of course," Margot replied, not looking up from her work. "Why do you do this? Run this studio, teach people, keep this space open?" Margot's hands continued their rhythm for a moment before she answered. "I suppose because I needed it once myself," she said. "I needed a place to come and be quiet, to work with my hands, to make something that didn't require me to be anyone other than who I was in that moment. Someone gave that to me. Now, I try to pass it along." "What happened?" Margaret asked. "If you don't mind my asking." "I lost my daughter," Margot said simply. "She was 16, car accident, very sudden. Her hands kept moving through the warp. Afterward, I couldn't work, couldn't think, couldn't bear to be around people who wanted me to be normal again, to be over it, to move on. But I could weave. Weaving didn't ask anything of me except that I show up and move the shuttle back and forth. So that's what I did. For months, that's all I did. And slowly, I came back to myself. Or to a new version of myself. The one who could live with what had happened." Margaret's hands had stilled on her own loom. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Thank you. It was a long time ago now. 20 years. Margot looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. "I don't tell you this for sympathy. I tell you because I know you're healing from something too. I don't know what, and you don't need to tell me. But I know that's why you're here. And I want you to know that this place, this practice, it can hold you while you do that. It held me. It's held others. It will hold you for as long as you need." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows. Inside, the loom stood silent and patient, waiting for hands to bring them to life. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something softer than the numbness she'd been carrying. Something like possibility. "Thank you," she said quietly. Margot nodded and returned to her weaving. Margaret did the same. The shuttles passed back and forth, weaving thread into fabric, fabric into healing, healing into whatever would come next. November arrived with its particular brand of gray beauty, bare trees etched against pale skies, frost on the windows each morning, early darkness that made the studio's warm lights even more welcoming. Margaret had settled into a rhythm. She woke early in Jane's guest room, made coffee in the small kitchenette, and spent the morning reading or walking the now familiar paths around town. After lunch, she would make her way to the weaving studio, where she would work until dinner time. Some days, Jane would have her over for meals. Other days, Margaret made simple dinners in her little space. Soup, bread, things that didn't require much thought. It was a quiet life, a small life, by the standards of her previous existence. But Margaret found she didn't miss the bigness, the noise, the constant demands. She didn't miss her phone buzzing with urgent messages. She didn't miss the pressure to be impressive, to be successful, to be anything other than a woman sitting at a loom, making fabric one thread at a time. Her sister had stopped asking when she planned to go back to Boston, stopped suggesting she might want to look for consulting work or part-time opportunities. Jane had simply accepted that Margaret was here now, and that here was where she needed to be. At the studio, Margaret had graduated from simple scarves to more complex projects. Margot had taught her twill patterns, techniques where the weft thread passed over and under multiple warp threads in a specific sequence, creating diagonal lines and textures in the finished fabric. Margaret loved the problem-solving aspect of it, the way she had to plan the threading carefully, the way a small change in the pattern could transform the entire piece. She was currently working on a length of fabric that she thought might become a wall hanging, deep burgundy and cream, with a diamond pattern that emerged like a whisper as the fabric grew. She wasn't sure what she would do with it when it was finished. That wasn't the point. The point was the making, the doing, the slow accumulation of threads into something that hadn't existed before. One Thursday afternoon, a new person appeared in the studio. Margaret noticed her immediately, though she tried not to stare. The woman was young, late 20s perhaps, with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and paint stains on her jeans. She stood in the doorway the way Margaret had stood weeks before, uncertain, taking in the space. Margot greeted her warmly, led her to the small table loom, showed her the basics. Margaret remembered her own first day and felt a small kinship with this stranger, this other person who had found her way here for reasons of her own. The woman worked quietly for an hour, then came to stand near Margaret's loom, watching her work. "That's beautiful," she said. "The pattern. How do you know which threads to lift?" Margaret paused, considering how to explain. "You plan it out beforehand," she said. "Each threading pattern creates specific possibilities. Once the loom is warped, you're just following the sequence. The hard part is setting it up. After that, it's just repetition." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "I like that you have to plan but then surrender to the process." "Are you an artist?" Margaret asked, noticing the paint stains again. "Painter, yes, or trying to be." The woman smiled ruefully. "I'm Grace, by the way. I just moved here from New York, trying to figure out if I can make a life making art, or if that's just a beautiful, impossible dream." "Margaret, and I don't know the answer to that, but I hope you can." Grace settled onto a stool nearby, watching Margaret work. It should have been intrusive, but somehow it wasn't. There was something peaceful about her presence. "Can I ask what brought you to weaving?" Grace said after a while. Margaret considered how to answer. "I needed to do something with my hands," she said finally. "Something that would hold my attention, but not require me to be clever or strategic or constantly performing. Something that would let me just be." Grace nodded slowly. "That makes sense. I paint for similar reasons, I think. It's the only time my brain gets quiet." They sat together in comfortable silence, the loom providing its rhythmic soundtrack. Eventually, Grace returned to her own work, But over the following weeks, she became a regular presence in the studio, and she and Margaret developed a quiet friendship based more on shared space than on lengthy conversations. Grace would paint in her studio, a small rented space above a hardware store, then come to the weaving studio in the afternoons to work on increasingly ambitious projects. She had a natural talent for color and pattern, and her weavings began to reflect her painter's eye. Unexpected color combinations, bold stripes, experimental textures. Margaret found herself looking forward to Grace's presence. The younger woman brought an energy to the studio that was gentle but alive, a curiosity about the craft that reminded Margaret why she loved it. One afternoon, Grace brought her sketchbook and showed Margaret some paintings she was working on, large abstract canvases that somehow captured the feeling of landscape without depicting any specific place. "These are remarkable," Margaret said, and meant it. "Thank you. I'm trying to get into a gallery in Burlington. There's a show in December. Local artists, all work from this year. I don't know if I'm good enough yet, but I'm trying." "You're good enough," Margaret said with certainty. She didn't know much about art, but she knew authenticity when she saw it. Grace smiled, looking both pleased and embarrassed. "That means a lot coming from you." "From me? I'm just someone who weaves." "No," Grace said thoughtfully. "You're someone who knows how to pay attention, how to work carefully, how to let something become what it wants to become rather than forcing it. That's what I'm trying to learn to do with painting. I think that's what we're all trying to learn here." Margaret thought about this later, after Grace had left and she was finishing up her own work for the day. Was that what she was doing here? Learning to let things become what they wanted to become? Learning not to force, not to push, not to demand that life be other than what it was? Maybe that was exactly it. As November deepened and the days grew shorter, the studio took on an even cozier atmosphere. Margot brought in a small space heater and made tea in the afternoon. Chamomile or mint, served in mismatched mugs that had accumulated over the years. The weavers would take breaks together, warming their hands on their mugs, talking quietly about their projects, or about nothing in particular. Margaret learned bits and pieces about the others. Elena, the woman who wove patterns like birch bark, was a therapist who found that weaving helped her process what she heard in her sessions without bringing it home with her. David, who made blankets for the homeless shelter, had lost his wife 2 years ago and found that the repetitive motion of weaving was the only thing that quieted his grief enough to let him sleep at night. Sarah, the college student, was studying engineering, but loved the ancient technology of the loom, the pure mechanical beauty of it. They were all here for their own reasons. They were all healing from something, or building something, or simply being something. The studio held them all without judgment, without demand. One late November afternoon, as the first snow of the season began to fall outside, Margot gathered everyone together. "I want to show you something," she said, pulling out a large cardboard box from the storage room. Inside were pieces of weaving, old and carefully preserved. A baby blanket, yellowed with age, a tablecloth with an intricate border, a shawl so finely woven it looked like lace. "These were made by my grandmother and her mother and her mother before that," Margot said, handling each piece with reverence. 4 generations of weavers. They didn't think of themselves as artists. They just made what was needed: blankets, cloth, useful things. But look at the care in every thread. Look at how they honored the work, even when it was just making something for everyday use. She passed the pieces around, and each person handled them carefully, sensing the history in the threads. "I show you these," Margot continued, "because I want you to understand something about what we do here. It's not just about making pretty things, though that's fine too. It's about connecting to a tradition, to a practice that has sustained humans for thousands of years. When you weave, you're joining a lineage. You're part of something much larger than yourself." Margaret held the old shawl, feeling the weight of history in her hands. She thought about all the people who had sat at looms over the centuries, women mostly, though men too in some cultures, making fabric for their families, for their communities, for themselves. All those hands passing shuttles back and forth, all that patient attention, all that accumulated care woven into thread. She felt something shift in her understanding. This wasn't just therapy, wasn't just a pleasant way to pass the time. This was a practice, a discipline, a way of being in the world. It was ancient, and it was current. It was personal, and it was universal. She carefully folded the shawl and passed it to Grace, who received it with the same reverence. Outside, the snow fell steadily now, covering the town in white. Inside, the studio glowed warm and golden. The looms stood ready, waiting for hands to bring them to life, to continue the tradition, to weave the present into the future, one thread at a time. Margaret returned to her loom and continued her work. The diamond pattern emerged, slowly, steadily. She didn't know what would happen next week or next month. She didn't know if she would ever return to Boston or what version of herself she might become. But she knew that right now, in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. The shuttle passed back and forth, weaving thread into fabric, fabric into meaning, meaning into peace. December transformed the valley into a landscape of white and gray and the deep green of evergreens. The studio's windows frosted over at night, creating patterns more intricate than any weaving. Inside, the space heater hummed steadily, and the old building held its warmth the way good buildings do, the way places that have sheltered people for centuries learn to do. Margaret had been in Vermont for 4 months now. She no longer thought of herself as visiting, as temporarily displaced, as someone who would soon return to her real life. This was her real life now, the guest room with its slanted ceiling, the morning walks through snow-quiet streets, the afternoons at the loom, the simple dinners alone or with Jane, the early darkness that came at 4:30 and felt not oppressive, but cozy, an invitation to rest. Her friends from Boston had stopped calling regularly. The first few weeks they had checked in often, concerned, encouraging her to take the time she needed, but clearly expecting that need to be brief, measurable, concluded by some obvious milestone. When she hadn't returned after a month, they'd ask gently about her plans. When she'd said she didn't have any, the calls had become less frequent, more awkward. People didn't know how to hold space for open-ended healing. Only her friend Rachel persisted, calling every Sunday evening, never asking when Margaret was coming back, just asking how she was. Margaret appreciated this more than she could express. At the studio, the rhythm of work continued. Margaret had finished her wall hanging, the burgundy and cream diamond pattern that had taken weeks to complete. She'd blocked it carefully, washing it gently and laying it flat to dry, and was surprised by how beautiful it looked when finished. The diamonds seemed to shimmer, catching light differently depending on the angle. She'd hung it in her room above Jane's garage, and every morning she woke to see it. This thing she had made, this proof of patience and attention. Now she was working on something new, a series of towels in shades of gray and white and palest blue. They were simpler than the wall hanging, but Margaret found satisfaction in the straightforward pattern, in making things that were meant to be used, to be useful. Margot had been right when she said there was honor in making everyday things with care. Grace had become a regular fixture at the studio and in Margaret's life. They often got coffee together after weaving, walking through the cold streets to the small cafe on Main Street, sitting by the window and watching the snow fall while they talked about everything and nothing, art and fear, and what it meant to choose a life that didn't follow the expected path. Grace had gotten her work into the Burlington Gallery show, 3 paintings, and 2 had sold on opening night. She'd been giddy with excitement, and Margaret had felt genuinely happy for her, this young woman brave enough to chase her dreams. "You should come to the next show," Grace had said. "It's not till March, but I'll have more work ready by then. I'd love for you to see it properly displayed." "I'll be there," Margaret had promised, and realized she meant it, that March no longer seemed impossibly far away, that she could imagine herself still here, still weaving, still living this quiet life. One snowy Thursday afternoon in mid-December, a man came into the studio whom Margaret had never seen before. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and kind eyes, carrying a large plastic tub. "Margot," he called out, "I brought those fleeces I promised you." Margot looked up from her loom with delight. "Thomas, you wonderful man. Everyone, take a break. You need to see this." The weavers gathered around as Thomas opened the tub to reveal clouds of wool, freshly washed and carded, cream and gray and brown, and a pale gold that seemed to hold sunlight. "From my sheep," Thomas explained. "Small flock, just 6 of them, but they give beautiful wool. Margot's been after me to bring her some for months." "I want to teach a spinning class," Margot said, running her hands through the fleeces, start to finish, from raw wool to woven cloth. "Who's interested?" Margaret found her hand rising before she'd consciously decided. Grace's hand went up too, and Elena's, and David's. Sarah was too busy with school, but everyone else wanted to learn. "Excellent," Margot said. "We'll start in January, after the holidays. Thomas, can you spare more fleece? We'll need enough for everyone to work with." "Take what you want," Thomas said generously. "The sheep make more every year, and I've got more than I can use." He stayed for a while, and Margaret learned that he had retired here 5 years ago from a career in architecture, bought a small farm on the edge of town, and discovered he loved keeping sheep more than he'd ever loved designing buildings. "It's honest work," he said. "The sheep don't care about my credentials or my portfolio. They just want good pasture and clean water and protection from coyotes. That clarity, it's restful." Margaret understood exactly what he meant. After Thomas left, Margot brought out different samples of hand-spun yarn, showing them the variety of textures and thicknesses that were possible, explaining how spinning and weaving together formed a complete cycle, how humans had been doing this for 10,000 years, how it connected them to something ancient and essential. In the old days, she said, people knew their cloth intimately. They knew the sheep it came from, watched the wool being cleaned and carded and spun and woven. They understood the labor in every thread. We've lost that in our modern world. We buy clothes without thinking about where they came from, who made them, what went into them. But here, in this studio, we can remember. We can make things we understand completely, from beginning to end. Margaret thought about her closet back in Boston, full of clothes she'd bought without thought, designer labels she'd chosen because they signaled the right things to her colleagues and clients. She couldn't remember the last time she'd really loved a piece of clothing, really felt connected to it. Everything had been costume, armor, camouflage. But the scarf she'd woven, the first simple one in blues and grays, she wore that almost every day now. She loved it fiercely, this thing her own hands had made. When she wrapped it around her neck, she felt held, protected, connected to herself in a way nothing store-bought had ever made her feel. That evening, Jane invited Margaret for dinner. Her sister had made soup and bread, and they ate at the kitchen table, while outside the snow continued its quiet fall. "You seem different," Jane said, not unkindly, settled, like you're actually here instead of just waiting to leave. Margaret considered this. "I think I am here," she said. "I don't know for how long, but I'm not waiting anymore. I'm just being." "Good," Jane said simply. "You're welcome to stay as long as you want. I mean that. The room's yours." "Thank you. That means everything." They sat in comfortable silence, sisters who had grown apart during Margaret's busy years, but were finding their way back to each other now, in this quiet season. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. "Are you happy, living here, this small-town life? Don't you ever want something more?" Jane smiled. "I used to think I needed more. When we were younger, I felt like I was supposed to want your life, the career, the city, the success. But I realized I was happiest when things were simple. My teaching job, my garden, my friends here, this house. It's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest, then release. "I spent so long thinking I had to be impressive," she said quietly. "I thought if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, proved enough, then I would finally feel okay. But I never did. I just felt more and more hollow." "And now?" Jane asked. "Now I sit at a loom and make towels, and it feels more meaningful than anything I did in my entire career." Jane reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "That's because it is meaningful. You're making something real with your own hands, at your own pace, for your own reasons. There's nothing more meaningful than that." Later, walking back to her room through the snow, Margaret thought about meaning and worth and how she'd been measuring both by the wrong standards for so long. She thought about Thomas and his sheep, about Grace and her paintings, about Margot and her 40 years of weaving, about Jane and her simple happiness. She thought about the spinning class starting in January, about learning to transform raw fleece into yarn, about completing the cycle from animal to thread to cloth. She thought about how satisfying it would be to make something from absolute beginning to absolute end, understanding every step of the process. When she reached her room, she stood for a moment, looking at her wall hanging, the diamonds catching the lamplight, seeming to breathe with subtle shifts of color and shadow. She had made that. Her hands, her attention, her patient hours of work. It existed because she had made it exist. For the first time in years, Margaret felt proud of something she had done. Not proud in the way she'd felt after landing a big client or delivering a successful presentation. That proud had always been tinged with anxiety, with the immediate pressure to do it again, to prove it wasn't a fluke. This proud was quieter, deeper, not about external validation, but about internal alignment. She had done something that mattered to her in a way that honored her values, and the thing itself was the reward. She slept well that night, lulled by the silence of falling snow and the memory of the loom's rhythm, the shuttle passing back and forth, weaving thread into fabric, fabric into purpose, purpose into peace. January arrived sharp and bright, the sun reflecting off snow so white it hurt to look at without squinting. The days were still short, but beginning imperceptibly to lengthen. You could feel winter considering its eventual departure, though that departure was still months away. The spinning class began on the first Tuesday of the new year. Margot had acquired several spinning wheels, some borrowed from a fiber arts guild in Burlington, one elderly wheel that had belonged to her grandmother, and a new one she'd ordered for the studio. She'd also brought in drop spindles for those who wanted to try the most ancient form of spinning first. "We'll start with drop spindles," she announced, as the 6 of them gathered. Margaret, Grace, Elena, David, and 2 new people who'd heard about the class and wanted to learn. These are what humans used for thousands of years before spinning wheels were invented. They're simple, portable, and they teach you everything you need to know about how twist moves through fiber. She demonstrated, taking a handful of Thomas's cream-colored fleece, drafting it out with practiced fingers, and attaching it to a wooden spindle that looked like a stick with a weight at the bottom. Then she gave the spindle a spin, and it rotated like a top, adding twist to the fiber, transforming the cloud of wool into a fine, strong thread. See? The spindle does the work. You just control how much fiber you feed it. The twist moves up through the fiber, binding it together, making it strong enough to weave with. She handed out drop spindles and portions of fleece to everyone. Margaret took hers and tried to follow Margot's demonstration. The wool felt strange in her hands, lanolin soft, full of potential. She tried to draft it out, pulling gently to thin the fibers, then attached it to the spindle and gave it a spin. The spindle dropped, spinning fast, but Margaret couldn't figure out how to feed the fiber evenly, and the thread that formed was lumpy and irregular. She tried again, and again. It was harder than it looked. Around her, the others were struggling too. Grace's spindle kept falling off its thread. David's wool wasn't drafting smoothly. Even Elena, who usually picked up new techniques quickly, was frowning in concentration. "Don't worry," Margot said cheerfully. "Spinning takes practice. Your first yarn is supposed to be terrible. Mine looked like a string of lumpy beads. Just keep going." So they did. For the next 2 hours, they spun and struggled and laughed at their mistakes. Slowly, gradually, the movements began to make sense. Margaret's yarn was still wildly uneven, but she could see improvement. could feel her hands beginning to understand what they were supposed to do. "This is so much harder than weaving," Grace muttered, studying her lumpy yarn with dismay. "Different skill set," Margot said. "Weaving is about rhythm and pattern. Spinning is about feel, learning to sense exactly how much fiber to draft, exactly how much twist to add. It takes time to develop that sensitivity, but once you have it, you can spin without even looking. Your hands just know." By the end of the session, each of them had produced a small skein of very irregular, undeniably handmade yarn. It wasn't beautiful by conventional standards, but Margaret loved it, this thing she'd made from raw wool, from nothing, using tools and techniques that her ancestors had used for countless generations. The spinning classes continued twice a week. Between sessions, Margaret practiced at home, sitting in her room with her drop spindle and a bag of fleece, spinning while she listened to music or audiobooks, or just the sound of wind in the bare trees outside her window. Spinning, she discovered, was even more meditative than weaving. She could do it anywhere, sitting in the studio, curled up in her armchair, even walking slowly around her room. The spindle turned, the wool transformed, and her mind found a kind of peace deeper than thought. Her yarn slowly improved. The lumps became less frequent, the thickness more consistent. She would never be expert, but she was becoming competent, and competent was enough. In mid-January, Margot introduced them to the spinning wheels. These were faster than drop spindles, could produce more yarn in less time. But the principle was the same, adding twist to fiber, controlling the drafting, maintaining consistency. Margaret sat down at one of the borrowed wheels, an antique that creaked slightly as it turned. She placed her feet on the treadles and began to pedal, starting the wheel's rotation. Then she held the fiber to the bobbin and tried to draft it evenly as the wheel added twist. It was awkward at first, coordinating feet and hands, maintaining even tension. But gradually, as with the drop spindle, her body began to understand. Her feet found their rhythm. Her hands learned to feel the fiber, to draft it smoothly, to create yarn that was relatively even and strong. There was something hypnotic about the spinning wheel's motion, something that pulled her into a state of deep focus, where time seemed to stop or stretch or become irrelevant. She would sit down planning to spin for an hour and look up to discover 3 hours had passed. Grace, working at the wheel beside her, seemed similarly entranced. "I keep thinking this is what meditation is supposed to feel like," she said. "Not fighting with your thoughts, just giving your mind something repetitive to do so it can settle." Margaret nodded. That was exactly it. As January moved toward February, the studio took on a new atmosphere. The weavers were now spinners too, and the sound of spinning wheels joined the sound of looms. Different rhythms, different songs, all creating together a kind of textile symphony. Thomas visited again, bringing more fleece, this time some that had been dyed with natural colors, soft grays and blues and pinks made from indigo and madder and logwood. He stayed to watch them spin, clearly pleased to see his sheep's wool being transformed. "You know," he said, "I never thought much about textiles before I got sheep. Thought it was just something you bought at a store. But learning about all this, the shearing, the washing, the carding, the spinning, the weaving, it's made me see clothing completely differently. Every sweater, every blanket, there's so much work in it, so much knowledge and skill. It's kind of miraculous when you think about it. Margaret thought about the suit jacket she'd left hanging in her Boston closet, probably worth $1,000, made by people she would never meet, from materials she didn't understand, bought because it looked professional and impressive. And she thought about the simple scarf she was now weaving from yarn. She'd spun herself from fleece that had come from Thomas's sheep, whose names he knew, who he checked on every morning. Which had more value? Which meant more? She knew the answer. One evening in late January, Jane came to the studio for the first time. She'd been curious about what Margaret was doing, why she spent so many hours there, what had captured her attention so completely. Margaret showed her around, introduced her to Margot and the others, demonstrated spinning and weaving. Jane tried the drop spindle and laughed at her clumsy attempts. But Margaret could see she was impressed by what everyone was making, by the quality of focus in the room. "This is wonderful," Jane said. "I had no idea. I knew you were weaving, but I didn't understand the culture of it, the community." "It's not really about community," Margaret tried to explain, "or not in the usual way. We're not here to socialize. We're here to work. But there's something powerful about working alongside other people who are engaged in the same practice, who understand why it matters." Jane nodded slowly. "I think I get it. Like how I feel in my classroom sometimes, when the kids are all working on something and the room just hums with focus. It's quiet, but it's alive." "Yes, exactly that." After Jane left, Margaret stayed late at the studio. Margot was working on a complex pattern on the big floor loom, and Margaret was spinning at the old wheel, transforming Thomas's cream fleece into yarn she would eventually weave into a shawl. The snow fell outside, and the studio glowed warm and golden, and time moved in its own way, the way time moves when you're engaged in work that satisfies something deep in your soul, work that asks nothing of you except your attention, work that gives back more than it takes. Margaret's hands moved automatically now, drafting the fiber, maintaining tension, pedaling the wheel. She didn't have to think about it anymore. Her body had learned the language of spinning, the vocabulary of twist and draft and tension. She could feel when the yarn was right, when it was too loose or too tight, when she needed to add more fiber or slow down the wheel. This was mastery, she realized. Not perfection, but competence so deep it became intuitive. This was what it felt like to truly know something, not just intellectually, but in your bones, in your hands, in your body's memory. She thought about all the years she'd spent in meetings and on conference calls, talking about metrics and strategies and projections. She'd been good at it. She'd been successful. But she'd never felt this sense of mastery, this bone-deep knowing. She'd always felt like she was performing competence rather than actually embodying it. Here, at this spinning wheel, with fleece in her hands and yarn forming on the bobbin, here she was actually skilled, actually competent, actually creating something real. The wheel turned, the yarn grew, and Margaret spun on into the evening, surrounded by the quiet sounds of Margot's loom, and the building's old house creaks, and the wind outside playing with the snow. She spun until her shoulders ached pleasantly, until the bobbin was full of cream-colored yarn, until Margot finally looked up and suggested they both go home and rest. Walking back through the cold night, Margaret looked up at the stars, so bright and numerous in this small town, so different from the light-washed Boston sky. She felt tired but satisfied, the good tiredness that comes from hours of meaningful work, the tiredness that lets you sleep deeply and wake refreshed. In her room, she looked at her wall hanging again, and at the growing collection of handmade objects on her shelves, scarves and towels and a table runner, all things she'd made herself, all things that carried her attention and care in every thread. She was building something here, she realized, not a career or a portfolio or an impressive resume, something smaller and more essential, a life, a real life made by hand, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one thread at a time. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. February softened into March with that particular quality of late winter when snow still covers the ground, but the sun has real warmth in it, when you can smell spring underneath the cold, still weeks away, but inevitable now, promised. Margaret had been in Vermont for 6 months. In Boston, they would be wondering about her by now, would have moved past concern into puzzlement, or perhaps judgment. How could someone just leave, just walk away from a successful career, just disappear into some small town to weave cloth? It didn't make sense by any rational measure, but Margaret found she didn't care what made sense to other people. She only cared what made sense to her, and this made sense, this life, this practice, this slow, patient making of things with her hands. She had completed several full cycles now, from fleece to yarn to woven cloth. She had a shawl made entirely from Thomas's sheep, from wool she had washed and carded and spun and woven herself. It had taken weeks, and the result was imperfect. The yarn was uneven in places, the weaving showed the occasional tension mistake, but it was hers in a way nothing she'd ever owned had been hers before. When she wore it, she felt wrapped in her own patience, her own attention, her own growing skill. She felt held. Grace's gallery show in Burlington was scheduled for the first Saturday in March. Grace was nervous, had been nervous for weeks, questioning her work, repainting elements, convinced nothing was good enough. "It's good enough," Margaret told her firmly. "It's more than good enough. It's beautiful and honest and completely yours. Stop second-guessing." "Easy for you to say," Grace muttered. "You've actually achieved things. You've been successful." "I achieved things that didn't matter," Margaret said. "You're creating things that do matter. That's much braver." On the day of the opening, Margaret borrowed Jane's car and drove to Burlington through melting snow. The gallery was small but well lit in a converted warehouse near the lake, and Grace's paintings were displayed beautifully. Large, abstract canvases that captured something essential about landscape and light and the feeling of space. There were perhaps 50 people there, drinking wine from plastic cups, talking in that particular way people talk at gallery openings, trying to sound knowledgeable, trying to appreciate correctly. Margaret found it exhausting, this performance of culture. But Grace was radiant, nervous, but genuinely happy, and Margaret stayed for 2 hours, looking at the paintings, talking with other artists, watching Grace light up when people said kind things about her work. "Thank you for coming," Grace said, hugging Margaret before she left. "It means so much that you're here. You're the only person I know who actually understands why this matters." Driving back through the darkening evening, Margaret thought about witness, about how important it is to be seen by someone who understands what you're trying to do, who values it for the right reasons. Grace had that in Margaret, and Margaret had it in the community of weavers. And that mutual witnessing, that was another kind of thread, invisible but strong, weaving them all together. At the studio, spring's approach brought new energy. Margot announced she was offering a natural dyeing workshop in April. They would make their own dyes from plants and minerals, learn to extract color from roots and leaves and bark, understand how different mordants affected the final hues. "We'll forage for materials," she said, "onion skins for yellow and orange, black walnut hulls for brown, indigo for blue. It's another part of the complete cycle, growing or finding the materials, creating the color, spinning the yarn, weaving the cloth. Every step understood, every step done with your own hands." Margaret signed up immediately, hungry for more knowledge, more connection to this ancient practice. She had also started planning her next major project, a blanket for Jane, as thanks for the months of hospitality. She would make it entirely from scratch, from fleece to finished object, using yarn she spun herself and natural dyes she made herself. It would take months, maybe the whole summer. That was fine. She had time. She had patience. She had finally learned that the process was the point, not the completion. One afternoon in mid-March, a letter arrived forwarded from her Boston address, from her old company. She opened it with some trepidation. It was a job offer, not her old position, but a consulting role, flexible hours, remote work possible, significantly reduced stress, but still well paid. Someone who valued her expertise, who wanted her skills, but understood she couldn't return to the intensity of before. It was, objectively, a perfect offer. A way back, if she wanted it. Margaret sat with the letter for a long time, in her small slanted room, with her wall hanging on the wall, and her spinning wheel in the corner, and the view of hills through the window. A year ago, even 6 months ago, she would have taken it without hesitation, would have been grateful for the lifeline, for permission to ease back into her old life without fully committing. But now, reading it, she felt only clarity. She didn't want it, not even the flexible remote version. She didn't want to spend her days thinking about markets and strategies and quarterly projections. She wanted to spend them at the loom, at the spinning wheel, making things with her hands. It was an insane decision by any practical measure. The consulting work would pay well, would give her financial security, would let her explain to people what she did in a way that made sense to them. But financial security meant nothing if she spent every day doing work that didn't feed her soul. And she no longer cared about explaining herself to people who wouldn't understand anyway. She wrote a polite decline, thanking them for the offer, but saying she was pursuing a different direction. She mailed it before she could second-guess herself. That evening, she told Jane about the letter and her decision. "Are you sure?" Jane asked, looking concerned. "I mean, I'm happy to have you stay as long as you want. But are you okay financially? Can you afford to just weave?" "I have savings," Margaret said. "Enough for a couple years if I'm careful. After that, maybe I'll teach weaving, or sell what I make, or figure out some other way to cobble together a living. But I can't go back to that world. I tried, and it almost destroyed me. This," she gestured around at her small room at the evidence of her craft. This is healing me. I need to see where it leads. Jane hugged her. Okay, then I'm proud of you. That's really brave. Or really stupid, Margaret said, but she was smiling. Maybe brave and stupid are the same thing sometimes, Jane said. At the studio the next day, Margaret told Margot about her decision. She was surprised by how much she wanted Margot's approval, this woman who had become something like a mentor, something like a guide on a path Margaret hadn't known existed. Good, Margot said simply. You're ready to commit to the practice then, to let it be your life, not just your hobby. Is that crazy? Margaret asked. Probably, Margot said, smiling, but it's the good kind of crazy. The world tells us we need to make money and be impressive and achieve great things. But those are just stories. They're not the only way to live. You can also live quietly, making beautiful objects with care, being part of a tradition, honoring the work of your hands. That's a complete life, too. Maybe more complete than the other kind. Margaret felt something release in her chest, some last piece of doubt or shame or fear that she'd been carrying. Margot was right. This was enough. This was a real life, a full life, a good life. She worked at her loom that afternoon with renewed focus, beginning to warp it for Jane's blanket. She had chosen her colors carefully, soft grays and blues and creams, colors that would work in Jane's house, colors that felt peaceful and settled. The warping alone would take days. Threading the heddles would take more days after that. Then the actual weaving, weeks of steady work. Then washing and finishing and binding the edges. It was a long time to spend on a single object, but that was the point. The time was the gift. The attention was the gift. The care was the gift. As she measured out the warp threads, walking back and forth across the studio with yarn trailing behind her, Margaret felt completely present, completely engaged, completely alive in a way she'd forgotten was possible. This was it. This was the life she was choosing. Not the impressive one, not the lucrative one, not the one that would make sense to her old colleagues or her professional network. But it was hers, built thread by thread, day by day, with her own hands and her own patience and her own slowly growing skill. Outside, the March afternoon lengthened toward spring. Inside, the loom waited for her work. Margaret smiled and continued measuring, counting, walking the warp into being. April arrived with that particular kind of hope that only spring can bring. Crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow, the first brave daffodils, trees beginning to bud, the world remembering how to be green. The natural dyeing workshop began on a Saturday morning that felt more like May than April, warm enough to work outside. Margot had set up large pots over propane burners in the studio's small backyard, and the 8 participants, Margaret, Grace, Elena, David, Thomas, and 3 others, gathered with bags of yarn and curiosity. We'll start with onion skins, Margot said, dumping a grocery bag full of papery skins into one pot. You'd be amazed how many colors you can get from something people usually throw away. They spent the morning learning about mordants, alum, iron, copper, substances that helped the dye bond with the fiber and shifted the final colors. They learned about pH and temperature, about patience and timing. They dyed skeins of hand-spun yarn in yellows and golds and oranges from the onion skins, then experimented with other materials Margot had gathered, walnut hulls for rich browns, madder root for reds and pinks. The indigo dye pot was kept separately, covered with a cloth emitting a strange, earthy smell. Margot explained that indigo was different from other dyes, required a living fermentation vat, needed special care and respect. Indigo is one of the oldest dyes humans have used, she said. It's mentioned in ancient texts from China, Egypt, Peru. Every culture that had access to indigo plants used them. There's something magical about indigo, the way it transforms on contact with air, the way the blues deepen and shift. She demonstrated, dipping a skein of white yarn into the greenish vat, then pulling it out and holding it up. At first it looked muddy green, but as they watched, exposed to air, the color transformed, deepening, brightening, becoming that unmistakable indigo blue. Magic, Grace whispered, and Margaret had to agree. They each dyed skeins in the indigo vat, watching the miraculous transformation, discussing how they might use these colors in their weaving. Margaret dyed enough yarn for a scarf, imagining blues shading from pale to deep, like water at different depths. By the end of the day, they had dozens of skeins hanging to dry in the sun, a rainbow of colors all made from plants and minerals, all created by their own hands. Margaret felt like she'd learned a secret, a piece of knowledge that connected her to thousands of years of human craft and ingenuity. As April deepened toward May, Margaret fell into the rhythm of Jane's blanket. Each day she would weave for hours, watching the fabric accumulate inch by patient inch. The grays and blues and creams wove together into a pattern that was simple but pleasing, a gentle gradation of color that reminded her of fog over water. She had found her rhythm now, found the speed of weaving that felt right to her, not rushing, not dawdling, just steady, consistent work. Her hands knew what to do. Her feet kept their own time. Her mind could wander or settle or simply be, while her body continued the work. This was what mastery felt like, she realized. Not dramatic or impressive, just competent and comfortable, skill so deep it became automatic, knowledge held in muscle and bone. Grace was weaving beside her most afternoons now, working on a series of small pieces that she planned to incorporate into mixed media works, combining her painting with weaving, creating textured surfaces that caught light in interesting ways. "I think I'm going to apply for an artist residency," Grace said one day, not looking up from her work. "There's one in New Mexico, 3 months, all expenses paid, but I'm terrified." "Why terrified?" Margaret asked. "Because what if I'm not good enough? What if I get there and realize I'm just playing at being an artist, that I don't have what it takes?" Margaret thought about this. What does what it takes even mean? You make art. You do it consistently, seriously, with real attention and care. That's what an artist is. The rest is just noise. "But what if my work isn't important enough? What if it doesn't matter?" "Grace," Margaret said gently, stopping her weaving and turning to face her friend. "Nothing matters unless we decide it matters. Your paintings matter because you pour your attention into them. My weaving matters because I pour my attention into it. That's all importance is. Sustained attention, sustained care. The world doesn't get to decide what's important in your life. You do." Grace was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise," Margaret said, smiling. "I'm just 6 months ahead of you in figuring out that external validation doesn't actually validate anything. Only you can validate your own work, your own life. Grace returned to her weaving, but Margaret could see something had shifted, some tightness in her shoulders had released. They worked in comfortable silence, the looms providing their rhythmic soundtrack, until the afternoon light began to slant toward evening. In mid-May, Margaret finished Jane's blanket. She washed it carefully, blocked it, let it dry flat on towels in her room. When it was ready, she folded it and presented it to her sister over dinner. "I made this for you," she said simply, "to say thank you for everything." Jane unfolded the blanket, running her hands over it, seeing the hours of work, the care in every thread. Her eyes filled with tears. "Margaret, this is beautiful. I can't believe you made this." "From sheep to blanket," Margaret said. "Everything done by hand. Well, my hands and Thomas's sheep." Jane wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and Margaret could see how it transformed her, how being wrapped in something made with such attention, such care, made her look held, protected, loved. "I'll treasure this forever," Jane said. "Honestly, this is the most meaningful gift anyone has ever given me." That night, Margaret lay in her small room and felt completely at peace. She had given something of real value, made with her own hands, infused with her own patience and learning and care. This was what gift-giving should be, not something bought thoughtlessly from a store, but something created specifically, personally, with the recipient in mind. June arrived with warmth and growth, the world fully green now, the days long and golden. Margaret had lived in Vermont for 8 months. She had been weaving for 7 months. She had transformed. She didn't look dramatically different. A little thinner maybe, more relaxed. Her hair less carefully styled. But inside, she was completely changed. The hollowness was gone. The constant anxiety was gone. The feeling that she needed to be someone other than who she was, that was gone too. She was just Margaret now, weaver, spinner, student of an ancient craft, inhabitant of this small town, this small life, this patient practice. One evening in late June, Margot asked Margaret to stay after the studio closed. "I want to talk to you about something," Margot said, pouring them both tea. "I'm getting older, not imminently dying or anything dramatic, but I'm 67, and I've been thinking about succession, about what happens to this studio after I'm gone." Margaret's heart beat faster. She thought she knew where this was going. "I've been doing this for 40 years, Margot continued, "running this space, teaching, creating community around this practice. It's been my life's work, and I want it to continue. But I can't do it forever." She looked directly at Margaret. "You've become a skilled weaver very quickly. But more than that, you understand why this matters. You understand that it's not just about making things. It's about creating a space where people can be quiet and focused and engaged with meaningful work. You understand the healing that happens here." "Margot," Margaret started, but Margot held up her hand. "I'm not asking you to take over tomorrow. I'm not even asking you to commit to anything yet. I'm just telling you that I see you. I see your devotion to this practice, and when the time comes, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, I hope you'll consider continuing this work, running this studio, keeping this tradition alive." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't known she wanted this until Margot said it, but now she realized it was perfect. Of course this was what came next. "I would be honored," she said quietly. "I can't imagine anything I'd rather do with my life." Margot smiled. "Good. Then let's keep working. Let's keep learning. Let's see where the threads lead." They sat together in the quiet studio, drinking their tea, surrounded by looms and spinning wheels and baskets of fleece and skeins of handmade yarn in every color. Outside, the June evening was soft and warm. Inside, the space held its particular peace, accumulated over decades of careful work, patient teaching, sustained attention. Margaret looked around at this place that had saved her, that had given her back to herself, that had shown her a different way to live. This place that might someday be her responsibility, her gift to pass forward. The looms stood ready, waiting for hands to bring them to life. The spinning wheels waited for feet to start them turning. The threads waited to be woven into fabric, fabric into meaning, meaning into lives, lived with attention and care. Margaret felt complete in a way she'd never felt before. Not because she'd achieved something impressive or reached some external goal, but because she'd found work that aligned with her values, a practice that fed her soul, a community that understood why it mattered. This was enough. This was everything. Outside, summer deepened into its fullness. Inside, the studio held its peace. And Margaret sat with Margot in the gathering dusk, two weavers together, two links in a chain that stretched back through centuries, two practitioners of an ancient art, two women who understood that meaning isn't found in impressive achievements or external validation, but in the patient daily practice of making beautiful things with care, one thread at a time. The shuttle passes back and forth, back and forth. The fabric grows, the pattern holds, and that is enough. That is everything.